Hi everyone, it's Rob Watson, the module leader for TECH3501, and this is the overview video summary of the 16th lecture, which actually what I'm going to call this lecture is it's called Participation and Change, and it asks the question, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw on the observations and findings from my PhD thesis. So I'm getting to share them with you, and it's helping me to frame a set of issues and a set of questions which I've kind of got some distance on now and realised that actually they're quite more detailed. So I'm going to give you a snapshot of some of the issues and some of the ways of thinking. So last week we covered the idea of ethnographic analysis, and that was the framework that I used, the methodology that I used for undertaking investigation in amongst community media groups in Leicester a few years ago. And then how I drew information out from that was using the Symbolic Interactionist approach, which we talked about at the beginning of the year, the beginning of the module. And then it's an issue of looking at the how do we draw information from that. And I've used Bloomer's 9 lines of entry into group life as a way of identifying and articulating a series of questions which I could draw then from the literature, which gave me some inferences and observations. And what I'll do is I'll go through that process and look at maybe some of the challenges in thinking about how we frame our thinking about community media, which goes beyond some of the established patterns of critical thinking that are demonstrated in many of the books and many of the articles that are written about community media. So our starting point is to think about the idea. Actually, I'm going to do this from rather than the notes are really. It's a lot of notes. It's like 40 odd pages, which I know is excessive, and I need to distill this down. So this is part of a thinking process for me to try and distill this down. Don't worry, there's only 30 slides, and we're going to talk about this in general. So it's very helpful to have the conversation that we'll have about this process. So it's very helpful for me. So the first question is the basis of participation in community media. What is that basis of participation? Because it's a term that's kind of used and thrown around, and kind of it means some things to some people and it means other things to other people. And we've kind of talked about this in previous weeks. But then, in thinking about what motivates people to participate in community media and to engage in creating media products and to volunteer to support community media groups, what is it that drives that? What is the motivating factors that kind of underpin and enable people to be participants within community media situations? So when I did my study in the field, I predominantly worked with 3 groups, which is Citizen's Eye with John, Leicester People's Photographic Gallery with Ian Davis, and Eva FM with Dee Barra. And what I brought to this was a search, if you like, for a concept of meaning which fitted in with the if you like, the grassroots approach to media development and media communication and circulation, rather than, if you like, the kind of transaction or transmission approach, which informs much of mass media communications theory type models. So I used the symbolic interactionist approach, which is predominantly associated with Herbert Bloomer. And remember, we identified this idea of social meaning, and that social meaning is akin to the Einstein's concept of time, space-time, and that geometry changes time and time changes geometry. They're not fixed concepts; they're relatable concepts. So if you change the social arrangements, you change meanings, and if you change meanings, you change the social arrangements. And what we are trying to understand is what drives those processes in different circumstances, or what arrests those processes in different circumstances. And each circumstance will be unique, and it will give rise to certain markers of a kind of culture. But what we want to do predominantly is to disentangle cause from effect, because what we see and what is visible to us and what is the marker that we're looking at is not, we cannot assume and deduce that it has an origin effect. Because often, I'll give you an example, there's drug companies will market their drugs on the basis of being able to say it has these wonderful effects and that it achieves this kind of, anti-anxiety pills, depression pills, that they achieve a particular outcome, and the scientific evidence that they draw on deduces from a sample that these drugs work in this particular way. What happens over a period of time as these drugs are being used is that evidence mounts up that they are not having the desired effect, that they're having an other effect. So we've got this split between deductive thinking and inductive thinking, between making leaps of faith, maybe, and building up evidence bases. So and scientific progress is based on a kind of a tussle between the two models, and good deductive thinking is only understood on the basis of long-term inductive thinking, and we often make the assumption for quick hits, for quick answers, when what we need to do is put long-term studies in place. So this isn't a quick way of understanding community media at all. It takes a long time to consider these things. So we're not looking for a cause and effect model. What we are doing is we're kind of framing and we've talked about this before, about framing the different ways that we can think about participation, different models for this. So the hegemonic model, the ecological model, the civic model, the technocentric model, and what that means in terms of roles. And then the next question, which is where Bloomer is really effective, is as a model for a thinking model for this, is that it's how is that enacted in group life? Where's the evidence for this? What is the evidence that we have for how the process of participation is actually enacted? What can we look for? What can we see, and what we can empirically investigate? So the participation process is something which can be mapped through, and Bloomer identifies 9 areas where we might look, and we can adapt these and change them. I've just used it fairly straightforwardly in terms of what Bloomer suggested. So things like, what kind of jobs are there? What kind of occupations and positions arise? In community media, these are not fixed. There's no set pattern. If you imagine in the teaching profession, occupations and positions are very clearly laid out. To become a head teacher, you follow a certain career path. In community media, there is no corresponding structure. So what takes place? So how do jobs get filled? Where do these jobs, roles, activities get enacted? What kind of, if you want to be a radio producer, you predominantly work in a radio station, and you bring people together around a newsroom as journalists. Community media, again, doesn't necessarily work on that basis. When we've proven this with the work that you did last year, working in cafes and using social media, and you can use alternative differently enabled forms of media in order to be able to contribute and communicate within a social situation, rather than thinking that you have to have a fixed base. So then Bloomer asks, what are the kinds of work that take place in these places? What are the kind of social relationships that are built up in these new scenarios, work scenarios? Are there any interest groups, like kind of professional guilds, kind of legal, legal insiders, and who do you push outside? How does money flow? Because we live in a money-based society, so money is a marker, a sign of the contractual relationships that demonstrate what's going on. And then are there goods, are there services produced within this process? Can we trace, do they show us anything in terms of the way that products circulate, the patterns of organisation of community media? And then what are the kind of patterns, what Bloomer calls the patterns of income? How is that distributed amongst people? So this gives rise to a series of observations, and this is quite extensive, and I realised reading through this over the last couple of days, I kind of need to find a way kind of highlighting some of these. So I've done a very quick. I need to go away for a week and have no other contact with it. I need to go to the Outer Hebrides and read through this material again just to figure out what's going on with it, just so I can prioritise some of the issues. But just for the sake of our lecture, I've highlighted some key issues that illustrate how our thinking might be directed if we follow this kind of method. So that's it. I'll be working through these in some speed. So at the end, what we're thinking about is how we, the kind of shift in language, the shift in vocabulary, the shift in understanding, and the basis on which we can look at participation as a change in language, a change in vocabulary, and kind of what that means for our practice. Right, okay, I've gone on for more than 10 minutes. So the notes for this session will be up on the module wiki fairly shortly. That's at wiki.our.dmu.ac.uk. Just look for the TECH3501 section. If you want to carry on the talk and discuss this and other issues, use the DMU Talk platform, which is talk.our.dmu.ac.uk. But I'll see you at the lecture.